Thank you. Pledge
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Here.
Mrs. Hoover?
Here.
Ms. Royce?
Here.
Mrs. Bowling?
Here.
Mrs. Witchebauer? Mr. Gerton?
Here.
Mr. Braden?
Here. We have 6 members present this evening. Moving on to amendments of the agenda. We have several. We are adding an appropriations ordinance. That will be M3. We are adding an ordinance about ODOT and Montgomery Road. That will be ordinance M4. We are adding an ordinance regarding fees and the schedule of fees. That we actually had the first reading at the last meeting. So this will appear as item L2. That will be the second item under second readings of ordinances and resolutions. Mrs. Bowling.
I move that we amend the agenda as stated.
Motion by Mrs. Bowling to amend the agenda as stated. Mrs. Franzen.
I second.
Seconded by Mrs. Franzen. Any discussion? Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would you repeat that one more time, the changes, please?
Yes. So ordinance number 3, M3, that will be the appropriations ordinance. Ordinance M4, that is regarding ODOT and Montgomery Road. And second reading of ordinances, this will be L2, and that is regarding the fees.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. President. Appreciate that.
Any further discussion? Motion on the floor by Mrs. Bowling, seconded by Mrs. Franzen, is to amend the agenda as stated. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Moving on to special presentations, we have Charlene Myers with Focus Cincinnati regarding Norwood Warming Center.
I'm going to need a few minutes to just set up my laptop. Is that okay?
That is fine.
Just get all these microphones. The other day. That's my daughter. That's my daughter, Sam.
She's beautiful.
Sam knew my daughter, that's why I said that. Thank you for being patient. I'm not seeing percent. Sorry, there it is. Okay. Here we go. Thank you. Sorry for the delay. Thank you for allowing me to present today on Warming Center, which I've kind of briefly mentioned at previous meetings. As you know, I'm Charlene Myers, and Pastor Bishop Sonny James is here also, and he has been involved in this project. So, warming shelter in Norwood. What does it look like? Why? Where? How? And what's next? I don't know how to get rid of that, by the way. Sorry. I don't know if somebody's smarter than I
For
am.
whatever reason, it only happens on that monitor.
Oh, okay, good. So what is a warming center? A warming center happens or opens when the weather turns a certain temperature, and that really is what a warming shelter is meant to do. We're following Cincinnati's lead. I've been working with Kevin Finn, who is somebody who runs the warming centers in Cincinnati, and he also leads the strategies to end homelessness. He also is a Norwood resident, and so he has really been helpful to me to kind of get this idea in the forefront of my mind. And so what Cincinnati does is when the weather hits below 20 degrees, they open up warming centers. One of the things that they do, however, is they use the CRCs. They're also open for a lot of days. And we're not really talking about a lot of days in terms of what we can do in terms of finances. Most of the shelters are open at a temperature mark, at some kind of temperature mark. The temperature mark that we're using is 20 degrees and below. We are staffing kind of a small staff and making sure that okay, here we go. And making sure that we're able to meet the needs of our guests. And so what I mean by that is the CRCs in Cincinnati are staffed by workers who are paid. This would be staffed mostly by volunteers. There would be some people who are paid, and I'll get into that in a few minutes, but most of it would be staffed by volunteers. And so that's a difference of what Cincinnati does and what we would do. Our shelter would be open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. With guests being transported to shelter house for overnight accommodations if they need it. So why should we be concerned about this? So as you know, one of the pillars of predicting life expectancy is good nutrition and also food insecurity. Norwood, Ohio, according to the report I have there, Does Place Matter, scores 10 years less than the average life expectancy of people. And you could see that on that report if you just Google that report. Hamilton County did it. It was a few years ago, a number of years ago, but Hamilton County did do that report, and that is evidence of that. We have meals every month to kind of combat this. Now, I'm not delusional in thinking that our meals are going to impact life expectancy in Norwood or make any great changes, but what we are trying to do is to meet the needs of our neighbors in need through food that face food insecurity. And this warming center would do the same thing. As you know, and I think I've presented this a number of times, that I do one meal a month at Christ the Savior Church. Additionally, sorry, I don't know what. Okay, sorry, that threw me off a little bit. So this will also be really mainly dealing with 3 meals a day for our neighbors in need. So last year, as you know, for a short period of time, an entire apartment building went without heat. For, again, a short period of time. And right now, residents of Norwood do not really have an established place to go if their heat fails or if something is happening there. There are several of our residents who hang out at the library, and I've talked to Kathy at the library, and they hang out at the library all day while it's open when the temperature drops. Some of our residents hang out at food pantries. One of the food pantries that I work with is Ashland Food Pantry, that is down the block from the church that we have the meals. And you'll see residents that are there hanging out inside the building, literally outside the building, because they don't have a place to go. And they also get a meal at Ashland when they go there. Food insecurity exists in Norwood. I don't think anybody would argue that. It's not just Norwood, it's all over the place. And we see it at our regular meals that are well attended each month. The meals, we've seen up to 80 people, but generally we're in that 50 to 60 range each month. We're also going to 2 meals a month outside of this warming center for next year. The guests at the meal include, again, our neighbors in need who are without housing. So how will this happen? We partnered with Pastor Mingo's church, which is Christ Temple FGB Church. That's for lack of a better term, the old Korean church that's on Williams Avenue, which will open its doors to help us with this endeavor. They will allow us to have 3 meals at the church. It'll open from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. There'll be TV for entertainment, a place to relax. No cots. So this is not about overnight. This is not about sleeping. This is not about staying in that location. There'll also be paid security. I was a former principal in Cincinnati Public Schools, and if there's one thing I know that security is needed in these situations, so there will be paid security that will always be on the premises. How long? So I'd love to say that it'd be open from, the minute the temperature hits 20 degrees and below for the entire winter, but the fact remains we don't have the funds for that, so we are starting small. As I said earlier, Cincinnati runs the warming shelters out of their CRCs, and CRCs have paid employees, community recreation centers. This will be all volunteer, and we welcome people to sign up to volunteer through our website if there's a little volunteer button underneath one of our pages. We have funding to be open for 14 days. Why do we pick 14 days? The average, I mean, we all know that weather in Cincinnati is up and down. One day it's going to be 20 degrees, the next day it's going to be 60s. But on average, Cincinnati is below 20 degrees for about 15 days. And that's average. So that means that some winters we're going to see total number of 15 days, maybe even 20. Some winters we're going to see 5 days, and that'll all we see. So we're looking at just 14 days to kind of create a budget, and that's what we had to do in order to open. We recognize that this is a first-year program, and we'll be kind of evaluating and adjusting as we go. And we would welcome feedback from City Council as we do this. We're also, as I said earlier, working with Strategies to End Homelessness so that we can learn from what they've been doing. They've been doing this for a number of years, and one of the things he told me when I first met with him is he started in a church, and I thought, I could do that because I'm in a church right now. So that kind of made sense to me. And so I don't know if it's appropriate to ask questions or if you're able to ask questions, but I did want to put this slide in here if that's something that you're able to do. But that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Any questions? Mrs. Hoover.
I wanted to share that Ms. Myers did do a presentation at the Housing Committee, and one of the questions that was asked was about the cooling piece. That was something that was of concern for us the last few years. Mm-hmm. And I'd like for you to share your response to that.
Yes, I mean, we would welcome the opportunity to do the cooling center. I would have to work it out with Pastor Mingo if that's something he could do in his church at that time. But if funds allow, yes, that would be something we would be interested in doing because it's equally a problem. It's just a problem on the other end.
Thank you.
And again, this is a team. We're working with Pastor Mingo. We're working with Bishop James and to kind of get this off the ground.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll disconnect. It'll just take me a minute.
All right. That's fine.
Thank you. Thanks. I don't know how to get your screens back on.
There we go.
Okay.
We're back. No. All right. So moving on to the next two items on the agenda, we have two separate public hearings. The first public hearing, notice is hereby given that the Norwood City Council, Hamilton County, Ohio, will hold a public hearing on Tuesday, November 26, 2024 at 7:30 p.m. at Norwood City Hall, second floor council chambers, 4645 Montgomery Road, Norwood, Ohio 45212, on the following items. Preliminary and final planned unit development, PUD plan, on the existing 4590 Beach Street Factory 52 PUD Development Phase 2 for properties known as 2760 Morgan Way, Hamilton County Auditor Book 651, page 19, parcel 02026, consisting of 2.267 acres, and Book 651, page 0019, parcel 0210, consisting of 5.644 acres. Persons interested in being heard will be allowed to speak during the public hearing. The text for the above listed items is available for public inspection in the office of City of Norwood Building Department, Norwood City Hall, Monday through Friday between the hours of 8:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. At this time, I will declare this public hearing open. Anyone to speak in favor of this matter, please step forward. Anyone to speak in favor of this matter? Anyone to speak in favor of this matter? Anyone to speak against this matter? Anyone to speak against this matter? Anyone to speak against this matter? Seeing none, I will go ahead and declare this public hearing closed. Moving on to the next public hearing. Notice is hereby given that the Norwood City Council, Hamilton County, Ohio, will hold a public hearing on Tuesday, November 26, 2024, at 7:30 p.m. at Norwood City Hall, second floor, council chambers, 4645 Montgomery Road, Norwood, Ohio 45212. Persons interested in being heard regarding the final planned unit development, PUD plan submitted by Tyson Hermes, Hermes Construction Company, on behalf of Gaslight Property to build a 108-unit apartment development for the property known as 1631 Sherman Avenue, Norwood, Ohio 45212, will be afforded the opportunity to be heard during the public hearing. The text of the final planned unit development, or PUD plan, is available for public inspection in the office of the City of Norwood Building Department, Norwood City Hall, Monday through Friday between the hours of 8:30 a.m. and 4:30 p.m. I will go ahead and declare this public hearing open. Anyone to speak in favor of this matter, please step forward. And if you can, please state your name.
Yes, good evening. I'm Tyson Hermes with Hermes Construction, the applicant. I did not plan on showing the presentation again. I think you've seen the presentation 2 or 3 times already for the interest of time and sanity. We've addressed all the questions and concerns that have been brought to us from staff, the Planning Commission, and this council. We've had no opposition at the Planning Commission. There was no opposition at the preliminary approval of City Council. And if there's no opposition this evening, I would ask that the City Council entertain relieving the requirement of having the 3 readings for the final approval. If there's no other questions, I'll sit back down. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else to speak for this matter?
Good evening. I want to personally commend Tyson Hermes and his entire group for selecting Norwood for further development. And I would encourage our council members to see more development coming in Norwood, just adding to us being the most awesome community in the country. And so on behalf of families that I serve, we are very much looking forward to it. And I do look forward to meeting with them and talking about, I know the minimum income or the average income. We may have different numbers on that, but I'm very excited, and I pray that all of our residents will welcome this development on that underserved piece of land at the moment. So, thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else to speak in favor of this matter? Anyone else to speak in favor of this matter? Anyone to speak against this matter? Anyone to speak against this matter? Anyone to speak against this matter? Seeing as there are none, I will go ahead and declare this public hearing closed. Moving on to requests to address council. We have 5 requests to address council. 3 of them are actually pertaining to an item later on the agenda. The other 2 we will go ahead and take care of now. The first is Wayne Allen Stanton III.
Good evening. I'm piggybacking off my last time I was here. If you were here, you would know. In Ohio, police officers are required to have surety bonds, specifically public official bonds, to guarantee their faithful performance of duty, as mandated by Ohio Revised Code Section 9.33. But also the chief, following into the chief investigating his own police officers, is a clear conflict of interest. And investigating oneself or one's own department can't ensure impartiality and accountability. External oversight is necessary to ensure justice and transparency under the Police Accountability Act, the Brady Act, 14th Amendment Due Process Clause. The laws and amendments ensure partial investigations and accountability within police departments, protecting citizens' rights and preventing conflict of interest. The police chief's actions were a clear conflict of interest, violating due process and police accountability laws. Him investigating his own officers, finding no wrongdoing despite evidence suggesting otherwise, sparking concerns of corruption and cover-up. Ohio Revised Code Section 109.65, and in parentheses I put 61 through 65, prohibits a police chief from investigating their own officers, ensuring impartiality and accountability. No surety bonds means no jurisdiction. Police officers without surety bonds are considered foreign entities and lack legal authorities to make arrests of enforced laws. Lack of surety bonds indicates a police officer is acting outside their jurisdiction, making them a foreign entity. The violation of 28 U.S.C. 3002, the lack of surety bond reveals a significant flaw in the officer's authority, making their actions unlawful and potentially leading to consequences. Police officers requiring individual surety bonds, not just blanket bonds, have jurisdiction and authority to enforce laws and make arrests. Hashtag jurisdiction, limited to courts and police stations. But also under 18 U.S.C. Title 241 and 242, the absence of individual surety bonds for our police officers undermines accountability and transparency, leaving citizens vulnerable. Under Ohio Revised Code 9.69 requires public officials, including police officers, to provide surety bonds. Moreover, Article 2, Section 14 of the Ohio Constitution ensures citizens' rights to remedy for injuries. The lack of individual bonds violates their provisions. Administrative law, the Administrative Code Section 109, which is February 1 of 2002, mandates individuals' liability insurance for police officers. Blanket bonds do not suffice. Constitutional law, the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause guarantees citizens protections against states' actions. Individual surety bonds safeguard this right. Without them, citizens are denied recourse. I request that this council take immediate action to mandate individual surety bonds for all police officers, upholding ORC Sections 109, February 1st, 2002. Together, we can restore faith in our law enforcement and ensure justice for all. Let our priorities, accountability, transparency, and citizens be safe. Thank you. And I also want to take note in the chief's findings and decisions. He said that their protocols and procedures in the ORCs are a guideline. So they don't have to say they have to uphold to the actual section or code or regulation or ordinance that they're trying to enforce. He's saying that there's just a guideline that the violations that I brought up, there's nothing, which I have hard evidence. I have video, I have statements from the police officers, Peyton C. Williams, badge number 225, K9 Ramos, and Sergeant Kenneth Devers. All three of them violated my rights. I just want some accountability, some recourse, some maybe reform, some transparency, please.
Thank you. The next request to address council is Bishop Sonny James.
Good evening, council, residents of Norwood. Recently, I presented to this council a young man that we have to keep covered whenever I send him out publicly. Because this young man now is in his 73rd day right off the street. Since then, we've worked with a number of families. Guys, I just want to be very candid with you all. I am beyond sick and tired of being sick and tired of being sick and tired of our residents not being safe and our families not knowing that they can send their children to the park. I was honored tonight. I met some young folks. And when I shake their hand and I tell them that I support them, I would be a liar if I didn't also address the things that could possibly hinder their ability to live the kind of quality life that they deserve. Youth crime and gun violence is at an all-time high. And so our initiative, many of you may have seen our initiative aired over and over and over again on some of the various networks. We're gaining tremendous momentum. And I want you all to support the things that we have coming forward. You see, some folks would say, Bishop, let the police do this kind of work. Well, I respect our police. As you all know, my son now is a police officer after he came back from his Marine training. But I'm not in opposition of our police, but I understand that it really takes a community effort. And the police can't be everywhere for everybody all the time. And that's where we come in. And we have, on record, retrieved firearms from some of our folk that really haven't learned to appreciate community safety as much as many of us have. And that brings me to our neighborhood partner, Ted's Pawn Shop, who recently were the victims of crime. Well, I'm putting it on notice before the community. We've already put our foot troops on the ground. We are going to give them a certain period of time to return the firearms. No harm, no foul. They know who I am. They know how to reach me. And I don't know if it's appropriate for the bishop to say, but they trust me. But if they do not return those firearms, for the record, I know ATF is offering a $10,000 reward. I don't want one penny of that money. Give it to our city. Give it to our finance and our budget department that they can use it to further advance our community. But we are going to retrieve those firearms and others so that we can help keep our community and the children in our neighborhood safe. So we're soon going to be encouraging the city administration to support another one of our ground stomping celebrations where we're going to go right to the streets. Right to where we all know some of these more high-risk students are and young people are. And I'm going to be asking you to support us as I've titled this next initiative, Let's Not Talk About It, Let's Be About It. And the whole focus is on being safe and making our community safe and all of you safe. I'm talking to some of our school administrators, expressing that I want Norwood to be my base because it is. And we're getting a whole lot of folk calling and saying, Bishop, come over here. And I'm like, nope, you come over here. So to any of our residents, if your young folks are a little bit out of control and you need help, we're here to help you. Call me directly or shoot me a text. I get a lot of calls. 513-487-8843. If you are not a part of the solution, you are a part of the problem. We will keep our community safe. God bless.
Thank you. Moving on to the next items on the agenda, we have standing reports of council. The first is Infrastructure, Streets, Parks, Recreation, and Public Places Committee from November 7th.
Thank you, Mr. President. To the Honorable Council of the City of Norwood, Ohio, we, your Committee of Infrastructure, Streets, Parks, Recreation, and Public Places, to whom was referred Elm Avenue improvements, beg leave to submit the following report. We discussed funding issues with the Elm Avenue sewer improvement and the upcoming Montgomery Road plan. We also discussed plans for tree planting in Victory Park on Veterans Day and future road improvement funding options. Respectfully submitted, Ms. Emily Franzen, Chairperson, Ms. Alexis Royce, and Mrs. Candace Winterbauer.
Thank you. Mrs. Bowling.
I move that we accept the committee report.
Motion by Mrs. Bowling to accept the committee report. Is there a second? Mrs. Hoover.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Next item is a Finance, Budget, Audit, and Claims Committee report. I understand since Mrs. Winterbauer is not here this evening, if we want to have this or someone wants to make a motion to move this to the next meeting. Mrs. Franzen.
I'll make a motion to move to the next meeting.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to move this matter to the next meeting. Mr. Braden.
I'll second that.
Seconded by Mr. Braden. Any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Next item is a Housing, Health, Environment, and Public Safety Committee report from November 20th. Mrs. Hoover.
Apologies, Mr. President. Those two items were not able to be presented this evening. We weren't able to get access to the printer for that, and the DEI Advisory Board is not, the report is not in
All right.
our office.
Motion to Mrs. Franzen.
I'll make a motion to suspend those two matters of business to the next meeting as well,
Thank you.
while we're at it.
Mrs. Bowling.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Bowling. Motion is to move the Housing Committee and the DEI Advisory Committee to the next meeting. Ms. Royce.
Never mind. I'm sorry.
All right.
Glitched.
Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Moving on to second readings of ordinances and resolutions. The first is a resolution organizing the Factory 52 Community Authority, establishing the boundaries of the authority, appointing members of the Board of Trustees of the authority, establishing the method for selecting the Board of Trustees of the authority, establishing the method for dissolution of the authority, and fixing the surety bond amount for the members of the Board of Trustees. So we do have 3 requests to address council on this matter. And the first is Lynn Ellis.
Good evening. Let me say that I believe that the petition that PLK presented to the city for the community authority smells a little fishy. Why now? Watching the council meetings from October until the public hearing, I've heard the lawyers for PLK say that the community authority was always in the plans. Really? Oh, but they had to wait for the infrastructure first before they came to you. I heard that the maintenance on their own property was unsustainable. Again, really? It would seem that anyone in business has expenses, and those expenses in particular, figured into their budget. Surrey Square does. All of the Rookwoods do, landlords do. Why not PLK? Reading on page 45, section F of the petition, any community facilities the authority owns, operates, constructs, or maintains will be financed through the use of community development charges. Well, could it be that PLK is having some money issues? But cutting right to the chase, Some council tried to identify the 2% as a fee, not a sales tax. Kudos to Mr. Girton and Mr. Breeden for saying it was a tax. I have the petition, and clearly on page 41, it states retail charge imposed is the same terms and conditions as a sales tax. The city won't benefit from this sales tax. We won't see any of that money. This sales tax will only benefit PLK. Meanwhile, the old Quality Inn site sits empty and is in a mess. I believe maybe we should make granting this petition contingent on completing that site first. After all, everyone that drives up and down Montgomery Road sees that. I guess we've learned nothing from the days of Rookwood. Most of you weren't here, so a little history lesson is in order. Rookwood, all phases, were sold to our city council as a destination for families. Events for families. Bring your kids. It'll be great. What events? The economic impact will be huge. Economic impact did not mean a lot of money for Norwood. People lost their homes there, and there was a big issue with the possibility of eminent domain. And what did we discover? That retail and offices don't generate millions and billions of dollars. Would our city still be in fiscal emergency if it did? It's also possible that PLK will want to acquire the homes on Robertson and Beach that surround phase 3 of their developments. And here we go again. I wanted to remind City Council that you represent the residents of Norwood, not PLK. I know some of you spoke to the vendors in Factory 52, but did any of you knock on doors of your constituents? There are people here tonight that just want to be heard. They're living in a nightmare with traffic issues on their streets. Did any one of you ask them if more entrances and exit in phase 2 would affect them? How about parking issues? The overflow parking from Factory 52 is causing issues for the people that live there. Not only the residents on the street, but the residents that live on the property of PLK with parking passes are finding they can't park. And how do I know? Because I spoke to them. Some of us spoke to them. That's how we know. Did anyone ask them? Did any of you ask them? Do you care that it's hurting them?
Thank you. Batteries. All right, next request to address council is Carmen McKeon.
Thank you. Do you still say your name and spell it before council like we used to, or you don't
You
do
can,
that
you
anymore?
can say it. We have the spelling on the sheet.
Awesome.
We're good there.
Okay. Good improvement. Thanks. Good evening, council members, government officials, concerned community members, and neighbors. When I was first introduced to Factory 52, I was excited to see something positive coming into our neighborhood. My neighbors were also excited. The prospect of having young people in the community with new restaurants and entertainment was a benefit. But our excitement turned to disappointment and later to exasperation as we experienced traffic, parking, and safety problems that came with the development. I'm requesting tonight that council not have the second and third readings of this ordinance tonight. The purpose of 3 readings being spread over 3 meetings is to give the community an opportunity to voice their concerns, for council members to consider those concerns, research, and hopefully facilitate mutually beneficial resolutions and compromises. That can't be done if you do all readings or 2 readings in a meeting. As for this particular resolution, typically taxes fund services like police, fire departments, education, health services, libraries, road maintenance, and other programs and projects that benefit the entire community. This tax would not pay for police, fire, education, health services, and the like. It would be used to pay for maintenance and events at Factory 52,
for the benefit of the developer. This resolution sets up an authority to establish a tax that would be for the benefit of a business, PLK, and not the community at large. This resolution will not assist the city to pay for the increased use and deterioration of our infrastructure, including our streets, water, sewer, in the area around the development. Nor would it pay for increased strain on police and fire. During public comments made by the developer's representative, he stated that, quote, "Without this, maintenance is not sustainable," end quote. That raises a red flag to me. How is it that we have a development that can't be sustained without a tax? In addition, the current resolution proposes the board consist of 7 people, 3 people chosen by the developer, 1 city official, and 3 members of the community at large. I find that makeup woefully inadequate and lopsided. I understand the developer is now calling this tax a fee. If they want to charge additional fees for goods and services, then at least the city would benefit from PLK paying the taxes on those fees and services. This resolution was proposed, would do little to benefit the community that is negatively impacted. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. The next request to address council is Terry Meager.
Good evening to all. As elected council members, you took a sworn oath with your hand on the Bible to make yourselves accountable for the city of Norwood and their citizens, to stand up and make Norwood a better place to live and work. Before ordinances and resolutions are made permanent, there must be a public hearing for the first reading. The track record of this council is to allow the public hearing, but to make a motion to read all 3 readings in the council meeting in progress. Now to add my comments to that. When council motions the 3 readings in one council meeting, that means only 1 public hearing, which will lead to no research in the opposition concerns, nor the chance for a citizen that may not be able to attend the first meeting to voice their concerns, or the people that are unaware of the issue to voice their concern at the second or third meeting, possibly. Now, if there is more than 1 reading, although the public hearing was closed for that ordinance resolution, you can speak at the beginning of the meeting at their public forum for the next readings, which is basically what I'm doing now. Each of the resolution ordinances have a suffix tag to them and declaring it an emergency, which I assume means council wants to skip the vote and read all 3 readings in that meeting. A council member will motion to suspend the rules to have the 3 readings. If a second motion is made, then the council president asks for a discussion, and then the roll call of the motion is made. Then the resolution ordinance is read 3 times, and then the vote is made by council. Just letting people know what goes on. The definition of emergency resolution, I found, is a resolution passed in the general meeting by the necessary majority of members dealing with an urgent matter requiring immediate action. I looked up the definition of emergency ordinances. It is an ordinance immediately necessary on the account of the emergency to preserve the public property, health, peace, and safety. I have not seen viable emergencies in the ordinances or resolutions that council motion to read in 3 readings at 1 meeting. On a side note, the meeting agenda is not available until Friday at 10 a.m. prior to the Tuesday meeting. That does not give you guys enough time to read over it. You guys got second jobs, I know. This isn't the only thing you do. People have lives. In my opinion, I think that needs to be at least 3 or 4 days prior. And I know that Norwood Community Television televises the agenda from 5:30 till the time of the meeting. Incidentally, I'm on the Sunshine email blast to receive the agenda, and I did not get one for this meeting, and I know there's others in the audience there that hasn't either. For an example, the building fee increase was an ordinance that was addressed last council meeting, a council motion to suspend the rules for 3 readings. and then vote thereafter. In the discussion prior to the vote, John Breeden and Jeff Gurdon asked about the details of the resolution for the provisions of the building department fees, probably because they didn't have time to read their packet, of which Mr. Powers explained the need of the ordinance and details of the fee. The declaration for the emergency was so that they could take effect, the fees could take effect the first of the year. Although that sounds reasonable, it should not be an emergency, especially since the fees hadn't been increased since 2007. A few more readings isn't going to make or break them. Mr. Breeden brought up that more discussion is needed from the residents, and he felt that there was an increase a few years ago in which Mr. Bunzel disagreed, so that could be researched for your second reading. I feel, as many others, that the decision on the ordinance as a resolution has already been made by council and that our voices carry no weight whatsoever, even when council is unaware of the details of the resolutions. In a nutshell, DEI encompasses the acceptance of differentials, and I believe we meet that criteria. D, for diversity, we need to have diversity on the council. You're allowed to have diversity and you ask to speak. E is for equality. That's being fair and impartial. Do you really think that you're fair and impartial when you don't listen to everybody's voice? I is an inclusion. The actions or state of including or being included in a group. The 2%. Are we going to know what's going on with that? It's not transparent. They're going to be building homes behind 100-year single homes on beach. We can't stop the development, but hopefully we can put some caveats in that will help our community. And I just wondering what your legacy is going to be. Do you have to be a part of the status quo and just pass things? Bring them up, discuss them. That's all I'm asking. Thank you.
Thank you. So at this time, we have consideration of the second reading of this resolution. Is there, Mrs. Hoover?
I'll make a motion, we have the second reading.
Motion by Mrs. Hoover to have the second reading of the resolution. Is there a second? Mrs. Bowling?
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Bowling. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen?
Sure. Thank you all for coming and making your voices heard. Like a lot of you, I didn't know what a new community authority was when this was first proposed about a month or so ago. So I did a lot of research and digging into it. Other folks have talked to vendors and other residents, and I can see how, in some circumstances, this would be a very valuable tool for a new development. However, as I kind of read more, it just didn't seem like it was a good fit for us. My feeling right now is it's something I feel comfortable supporting. It's 2%, yeah, that's not a lot, but it's enough that they want it. So I can see why they would want to propose this. I think it makes sense. If I were in their shoes, I'd probably propose it as well. But for me, having the use used not for like infrastructure improvements or other things around the property, but for stuff like events and maintenance, I don't think that's the highest and best use of that money. And although it's not all Norwood residents that go there, you know, it's people from Cincinnati, Kentucky, et cetera, it's still our people as well. And so for me, I'm kind of leaning toward no. Obviously, we're just doing the second reading. We're not like passing anything tonight. So that's just, I just wanted to talk about where my head was at, especially since I was not here last time due to being in a conference in Phoenix. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Mrs. Hoover?
I'll share, as Mrs. Franzen, I'd never heard of this before until it came on our plates. And since then, I've done a lot of research, mostly because I just find it interesting, comparing it to what's happening at the banks. And I will share, I have spoken with many residents. Some are for it, some don't like it. What is curious to me is a few things, and this is just information that I'm kind of gathering. PLK could choose to raise the rents. If they, right now, they're saying they spent about $400,000 on activities. And according to them, they had planned to ask for the NCA from the beginning. I was not in on those meetings, but that's what they are saying. So they could choose to defray the costs by just raising the rents, putting it on the vendors. However, if they do that, we have no influence on how those funds are spent. And when I say we, I mean the city, not specifically city council. One of the residents mentioned the 4 appointments. Those are city appointments, and what I mean by that is the city chooses those 4 people. So to me, it would be very important that we have, if we move forward, that the board members that are chosen by the city are really strong advocates and would push for the things that would be of benefit to all of Norwood. In that way, we do have some influence on how that money is spent. If they choose to raise the rent, they can do whatever they want with it. Another piece in my thought is that this is a private business asking us to support a business model. It's not my business model. I have a very small business model. They believe this is how they can be most successful. What I want for Norwood is our businesses to be successful because that means we reap the benefits. If this NCA is not successful, if their model does not work, they will get rid of it. If it turns out that 2% fee turns people away, they won't go and they will have to adjust. So I have some questions about where, and these, I have a couple questions that I want to ask, but I just kind of wanted to share some of my overall thoughts. Another piece for me is that the funds will be used for the public good. I know a few meetings, maybe it was the last meeting, what if they were to build a private pool? They can't do that with those funds. That the activities would be for the public use. One of the things that I enjoy about Factory 52 is when I have meetings there, people can come, they can choose to eat, they can choose to not eat. They can drink, they can choose not to drink. They can bring their water bottle and spend $0, but sit on the lawn and listen to the music or watch the game. So that is a way that Norwood residents can benefit without actually putting money into it. The other interesting piece of information I got from Mr. Klingfelter from PLK is they have roughly 177,000 unique visitors. And I believe this math gets kind of wonky, but Norwood is less than 10% of that. So the vast majority of people that are spending their dollars in Factory 52 are not Norwoodians. Now, obviously, the folks that live there are Norwoodians, but the bulk of the people that are going are not from Norwood. They know that because they have a Google account, so they can actually see who is going from what location. It's a little Big Brother, but it's pretty impressive when you see that the breadth of that they're drawing from. So those are some of the pieces of information that I have. I've had several people write me emails. I've responded to them. I've had the opportunity to talk to some folks. I continue to be open to that. This is brand new. You know, I'm not an economist. I'm just figuring out from the data that we've been presented with, and our conversations not only with our financial attorney, but also our law director, who's pretending like he's not here. So those are just some of my top level thoughts.
Any other discussion? Mrs. Bowling?
Yeah, I think it's important to clarify that in order for us to have these conversations and to to work through what we're thinking about these things, we have to have readings. So if we just immediately decide there will be no more readings, we can't share this information with each other. As most folks know, there are restrictions about us speaking about city issues outside of a council meeting. So in order for us to share these ideas as a group, we have to have the readings. So we can't say no readings and then we all go talk about it. It's part of the process that we have the readings, and us agreeing to have readings is not us voting or marking our stamp of approval on an ordinance or a resolution. It's just us following process and giving ourselves opportunity to discuss as a collective what our thoughts are on these. And so thinking that us having readings is us having already made our mind up is not often the case. It just gives us a chance to discuss as a group. I think I am quite undecided on this issue. I've heard from a lot of residents. I've gotten a lot of emails, which I'm very grateful for people taking the time to send. I have read the entire state code on new community authorities, and I'm not a lawyer, and I will tell you it is boring. I had to Google so many things, but it's interesting, and it gives a lot of insight into how these work. And then that got me curious. So I started looking into other new community authorities that exist within the state of Ohio. As far as I can tell, there are about a dozen. I thought there would be more than that. That was interesting to me, but they are very spread out. They are up in Cleveland and Toledo. They are down in Cincinnati. They are everywhere. And the way that I heard so many different people refer to this in terms of other community authorities that exist is calling it a tool for economic development. That is repeatedly the way that I heard it phrased. And I've heard residents, speak to the value of economic development and of new developments in our city. I'm so excited about the development on Sherman. It's very near my house. I hate seeing that plot of land sit empty. I love the idea of affordable housing coming to Norwood. And that is a development, and I'm really excited to have that. And I look forward to hopefully that coming to fruition. And so I think it's sort of a double-sided thing where we can't say that we want community development, we want economic development, and then we look at an economic development tool and say that it is inherently evil, there is this moral value to it, and we don't look into the impact that it could have. On the other hand, there are a lot of people who are throwing a lot of public events in Norwood that are free to the public, and they raise all of their own funding, and they pay for it out of their own pocket, and they fundraise within the community. Is there equity in allowing an organization to raise money from retail sales while we are asking other organizations to be self-funded or to, have to pinch and beg for pennies in order to throw these events? And I'm not sure about that. So I think these blanket statements about council being already decided and having made our minds up is just kind of short-sighted. And I think if folks took the time to talk with anybody on council, that's not the case. We all are really interested in hearing what everybody has to say about these issues. I'm glad that everyone is engaged and is showing up. And I am interested in hearing what everyone's thoughts are.
Thank you. Any other discussion? Mr. Garten.
I've made my opinion pretty clear about this before. I wonder, how do we respond when Rookwood wants this same thing from us? Can I finish what I was? Thank you. I wonder how we're going to respond when Rookwood asks this from us. Maybe they won't, but it seems to me that if this is a free pot of money that we just get to give to Factory 52 for a slush fund, why wouldn't Rookwood want this next? And I think it's just a matter of time, and I don't know that we would have a good precedent to say no over there and yes to this. Bottom line for me is I have knocked on doors. And I haven't had anybody who said they're for it. I've had people who have said they're ambivalent about it, but almost everybody I've talked to is not for this. And so I don't think this is good for the will of the people who elected me, where Factory 52 did not elect me. And so my vote is no on the second reading and on the third.
Thank you. Mrs. Hoover.
I was going to see if Mr. Woodside would be willing to come up. I thought I saw him come in. Oh, there you are. If you could come up and respond to Mr. Gerten's question.
What was the question?
About what if Rookwood would like to come and do this?
Well, I don't want to speak for Rookwood. I mean, again, this is a tax that is imposed on the patrons of these businesses. And so I don't think, generally speaking, that it's something that is necessarily what a property owner wants. You know, taxes, a lot of the time, are seen as a negative, especially for business owners. It's additional pay, an additional, payment that someone has to make for the same goods. And second of all, part of the legal requirements are that the 100% of the property owners have to approve of the formation of the NCA. So in this case, that would have been done by the submission of the petition by all of the property owners that would be within the proposed NCA. So I don't know exactly what the ownership structure is right now at Rookwood, but again, most of the time these NCAs are established when there is a single owner, generally a developer. In this case, there's multiple LLCs, but they're all controlled by PLK. So again, those are two things that I don't really want to speak to, but I know that it would have to be 100% of the owners. And the decision, to request basically a tax. Again, people talk about taxes and how they're used. This is specifically a private property owner asking for the tax to be established and levied within their property. And they also generally are subject to the other taxes and requirements that the property owners are subject to. So again, I think that this property owner, the fact that they would like this and they have looked at what the effects would be on their businesses operating there and whether it would attract other businesses to operate there, that's their decision. I have no idea what Rookwood would think about it. As I think I've mentioned before, the NCAs, just interestingly enough, in certain circumstances, there are developments where the developers particularly don't want an NCA because they don't want to have those taxes levied, whereas the communities want those extra resources to be available to pay for some of the services, improvements or what have you, they're going to be paid within the NCA. So point being there that it's very different. The dynamic is always different of who wants it, who doesn't want it. Obviously part of it is colored by the public perception and the different people that are making this decision. So it's going to vary across projects, where the projects are. Again, it oftentimes established towards the beginning of these projects being developed because it's something that a single developer wants to put in place. And so that's my thought on that. But again, it's very different, and I wouldn't want to, give my thoughts on whether the owners of Rookwood or some portion of Rookwood want something like this to be implemented there.
And real quick, Mr. Woodside, if you could state your role and experience within this matter for those.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
attendance.
My name is Patrick Woodside. I'm an attorney at Frost Brown Todd, and I represent the city of Norwood
Thank you.
in economic development bond council matters.
Thank you. Mrs. Franzen.
Something I looked at when I was looking at other new community authorities is one, the reason why there's so few is that originally it was only for properties that were 1,000 acres or more. That changed in 2018. So that's why there's some kind of these newer ones popping up. There's one in Franklin, in Dublin, a couple in Columbus, a couple in Cleveland area, and of course the Banks. North Market, one of my favorite places in Columbus, has one. So I can definitely see the utility of them. And if I were a developer and it seemed to make financial sense, sure, yeah, I would probably push for one too. Just looking at what the other ones are doing, they're kind of coming from scratch. They're completely redeveloping new land, a bunch of blighted properties. PLK has done that already, and now they want this NCA. I don't know. I don't feel comfortable giving them that right now. Especially not a 2%. The other ones I looked at were like 0.5%, 1%. 2% is the highest they can go, and I understand they probably want the flexibility to be able to compel the highest price, but, for me, I'm looking out for also, even though it's not mostly Norwood people maybe that go there, those people that live there definitely go to Gatherall. I definitely go to Gatherall. I'm a citizen of Norwood. So, yeah, it just doesn't feel great to me the way that they want to use the money. I think events are great, but like Sam said, there's great people who are putting on great events in the city that don't get to benefit from that. So anyway, that's just kind of where my head is at. One thing with second reading, third reading stuff, I don't know where everyone's, like we are not voting on this right now at all, but if we were put it to a vote, I don't know where people's head at, and Candace also isn't here. For me, I would be fine having a second reading just so we could all be here to vote on it. assuming that everyone is around. And that way, if it's 3 yes, 3 no, that seems like an awkward position to put, what would it be, President of Council would be the tying vote?
That
Or,
would be correct.
oh, wow, rude. So that's just kind of my feeling. But obviously, I would love to hear what y'all think.
Mr. President?
Yeah.
Mr. Moore?
Yeah, thanks. Just on a procedural matter, because there are blanks in this for the names of people to be appointed, if council wanted to pass this at their next meeting, you would need 6 votes to amend this, to add those names, and then you got to start the readings over again. So then you would need 6 votes to suspend the rules and have all 3 readings to pass it in December. So just want everybody to be clear, that's the procedures we're at now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Hoover?
I had a follow-up question, sorry for Mr. Sorry.
Quite all right.
Could you talk from a perspective for what would the potential risk be to Norwood if we were to pass this? Is there a risk to the city? Does it open us up to any liability? Does there, from a legal standpoint, are there concerns that you would have?
I wouldn't. I mean, there's not a financial obligation whatsoever on the part of the city in connection with this at all. You know, this is basically a way to establish a board, and there's various reasons why the boards of the NCAs exist as they do. You know, they are public boards because the majority of the board of the NCA is appointed by this council, so it is a public body. It's going to be subject to your open records rules, subject to your open meeting rules. But no, there's not a financial obligation. This is a simplification. But you are sort of the conduit through which these are formed, so that the public does have a say, so that you have meetings like this and it's an open forum in which it's established. But it's not something that really requires ongoing involvement, other than, as was mentioned here, there is a majority of the board that is appointed by this council. And the way that this particular NCA is proposed to be established, if you were to vote for it, would be that, you know, in perpetuity, essentially, as it exists now, the council would also appoint the replacements of that majority. So at all times, the majority would be appointed by this council. And that is the board that is going to make the majority of the decisions with respect to the funds that are generated through the NCA charges, the hotel and the sales, the retail sales. So again, this is a board that you are facilitating the establishment of, but you are not necessarily a party to the agreements or the obligations that would be incurred by the NCA itself. It is its own separate entity with its own board.
Thank you. Mrs. Bowling?
I have a few questions. When speaking to residents, a few different questions came up, and I knew the answers to some things, but I did not, again, I am not an attorney. I did not know the answers to all things.
Sure.
And you may know the answers. Within the board, are those paid positions?
No, they're not.
Okay. And I was not sure about that at all. And
I would have to check on whether it could be, but generally speaking, I've never, in this case, it's not anticipated this would be a paid board. I've never seen a paid board of a new community authority.
I didn't see anything in the state statutes about it, but that doesn't mean it wasn't there. And with the board, I heard rumblings, and I think we addressed this already, but I just want to clarify it for the greater good. If this were to pass and the 2% was set as the maximum, the board of the community authority could never exceed that. They could not internally vote to raise the fee to more than 2%?
That's correct. So the petition that was submitted that you would approve, that dictates to some extent what those limitations are going to be. And in that petition, it did have the maximum, excuse me, at the 2%, and then the hotel or transient occupancy tax would apply, I think it was 1%, if I recall. So what is going to happen is that if you were to approve it and establish the board would meet, there would be a document that is recorded against the property. And so when that document is recorded, that sort of establishes an ongoing obligation or limitation such that you couldn't exceed those limits that were set in the petition and as recorded in that declaration against the property.
So the board could not meet and say, we want to raise it to 4%?
Correct. They're going to be limited to that 2% that's recorded against the property and as approved in the petition.
That's all.
Thank you. Mrs. Hoover?
One was on compensation, which you answered. Apologies. One question for me is notice the issue of notification. My understanding is at the banks, there aren't signs that say you're paying this. What would that, is there a policy for that? Is there a way that individuals would know when they're spending, that there will be that extra charge? And ethically, I would think we would have some obligation to do so.
Not to my knowledge. I actually meant to go down to get lunch at the banks today so I could see what's on the receipt. And it is broken out as a charge. I don't know what exactly I think we discussed it before. It says something on there, on the receipt.
It does. It just says, I think it's a couple initials.
I think it says amenity fee. I think.
Yeah. And you know, if somebody's doing their research, they can drive up to Liberty Center and at the banks and go buy something and see what it says. But no, there's no obligation, just like the other sales taxes that apply, you know, that vary across counties. If you travel up to Butler, to Claremont, you know, there's nothing that requires, to my knowledge, that, you know, potential purchasers are aware of that tax. I mean, I know that you see Europeans often complaining when they come here because you actually, in most countries, have to pay or they have to show what the full price is, but that obviously is not a sort of the norm here in America. But no, to my knowledge, but I don't think, frankly, and again, I'm here on behalf of the city, so I don't want to speak for the developer whatsoever. But if that were a major concern, I don't think there would be, you know, again, the document that is recorded against the property could have other requirements. And if you want something that says there's some signage, again, I cannot answer that question, but I don't think that that's an unreasonable request if that is a concern with the council or the citizenry.
Mrs. Bowling.
I thought of one short other question that a resident asked that I was unsure of. Would the board have legal representation? If so, who would determine who provided that legal representation?
I don't know. I mean, yes, typically they do have their own legal representation. You know, the board, again, it's not, you know, just some do-nothing little board that meets every couple of years. It actually does have to have, it's going to have a budget. It's going to have agreements that it's going to enter into. It's going to enter into, you know, various arrangements that, you know, I certainly recommend to have a lawyer. The board itself can choose its own lawyer. You know, it varies, again, amongst different NCAs. Some of them are more active and they have a lawyer that's more involved. Others just want to have somebody there at the first meeting organization-wise so that you can have your secretary and go through your sort of the procedure of appointing your officers so that you can take action and basically, you know, make sure that certain, call it administrative tasks, are undertaken by any board that has to do those things. And again, it's going to be its own board, so theoretically they could choose their own counsel. Typically, you know, there's, for example, some say, can I do it? Generally, probably not, because there might be a conflict. You don't want the developer to have their counsel doing it. So I think that there are people, though, that it's not, you know, you're a lawyer. There's a relatively small group of people that are familiar with these things, and I'm sure that that board could have their choice, you know, at a meeting to either have somebody there that sort of is their de facto counsel while they set it up and then choose who their own attorney would be. But yes, they have that autonomy to choose their representation.
Thank you. Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I got a couple comments and a few questions. First of all, I want to pay Ms. Franzen a compliment. You've impressed me. You continue to impress me with your comments and your level-headedness. I think personally, your point, Mr. Gerton, has been proven a few times here this evening. Of course, other developers in this community will be curious on what's going on here and want their piece of the pie. Of course, why wouldn't they? So I think that's a great statement. A couple questions. The first one would just be an outright question, maybe for you, Mr. Woodside, but maybe for the law director. But my first one would be, would this be on cash sales as well, as far as someone using their credit card? Or if I'm paying for cash, is this going to be across the board, cash sales as well? That's my first question. Secondly, if I heard you right, Mr. Moore, through the chair, when we appoint this board, we have to have 3 more readings after this appointment. I just want to clarify that, make sure we pass this and then we create the board. Just a question.
Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. President. The ordinance you have in front of you creates the board. But in order to do that, you got to name people. And so there are blanks in the ordinance. Council hereby, one of the sections in there is council hereby appoints, blank, 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 and blank as the city's representatives on the board. Those names have not been filled in because I don't know who council wants to appoint. So in order to pass that ordinance, you're going to have to add those names. And to do that, you have to amend the ordinance. And once you amend the ordinance, you have to start the readings over. And so then you'll have to have 3 readings. Once those names are filled, once council amends it to add those names, then you'd have to have then you start the 3 readings again, you have to have 3 readings, so.
Thank you, thank you, Mr. Moore. Appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. President. I would hope that this board would be made up, if we choose to do so, of community members near that area that would have their lives affected by this. So I'm hoping that we have people in mind. I do. So I have spoke to a few residents in the area. I do have some that are willing to sit on this board. So I'm not sure when it's appropriate to name them, but I just want to make that comment. I appreciate everybody being here this evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Anything else for me?
Oh, the cash transaction?
Yeah, it would be, yes, it would be
Across the
subject to,
board.
all the sales across the board would be all subject to that, to 2% or less on the retail sales.
Mr. Braden.
Follow up, Mr. President, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that, Mr. Woodside. Thank you very much. And, sales tax, retail tax, nobody really hates to hear, raising taxes. And I see that we're not disputing it being a tax tonight. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Franzen.
Yeah, so I guess the motion on the floor being the second reading, we can choose to do that, and assuming that everyone's going to be here in 2 weeks, that would allow everyone to have their kind of final say and have more time to talk to more residents or do more research on this. Even though I think I'm opposed to this in finality, I'm fine with doing a second reading so that we can allow Mrs. Winterbauer and other people who may have just heard about this even to also have a say. That's my feeling.
Thank you. One more. Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm sorry, this hopefully will be my last. I'm sure everybody wants that. But I just want to clarify that I like to stay on the fence too. I like to not make my mind up, and I like to hear everybody's comments and their questions and concerns. So when we have a reading, I personally am okay with the reading and a yes on a reading. So like, let's say we're opposed to it and I say yes on the reading, well, we have to pass it. So when that comes to, then we make a decision whether we like it or not. So just a yes to a reading doesn't mean we're for that. I just want to clarify that for everybody and thank you for listening.
Thank you. Are you sure?
I'm good.
Mrs. Hoover.
Sorry, I have just some data to share. Not for you, Mr. Woodside, thank you. I do want to make it clear that I know several of us have done quite a bit of research on this. And I believe you brought this up at the last meeting, the banks and how they spent their funds. And we did get their year end for 2023. Again, this is for the banks. They got $680,000 from their 1%. They also got $143,000 in Dora cup sales, which is just a lot of cups. And then $59,000 for sponsorships. That's where people put their names on the cups. And of that, they spent $389,000 on community activities. $8,000 for insurance, $14,000 for administrative fees. So the bulk of the funds did go to community activities. And I did get a sample budget from PLK, which is just a sample budget. It's not written in stone. but they are anticipating $269,000. And some of their events, and this is just to share, Lunar New Year, St. Patrick's Day, Easter, Barbecue Fest, June Summer Concert Series, 52 taps, I don't know, I'm guessing that's beer related, fall event, holiday, city flea and markets, and then minor events throughout the years. And then overhead and maintenance is about 30 grand. So the bulk of their money, 180, I can't read to the math, 181,000. So just about over half, math, yes, over half would go towards events. Just so folks could have a sense of what they're planning to spend that money on. What's interesting is for me, Susan Hoover, I was really excited about the activities. That's one of the things that I really enjoy up there. I am a frequent flyer. I think they said the average person goes 1.9 times. I'm probably there 3 times a month. So I'm above average in that. And I know some of the residents that I spoke with, one in particular who lives at Factory 52, was less excited about the events and more focused on like the maintenance. She's like a nuts and bolts person. So that's just information for people to have a sense of what they are envisioning.
Thank you. Mr. Braden.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate that information. That's some of the things that I learned, and I appreciate that. But there was a few things that you mentioned. I just want to clarify real quick. You brung up Cincinnati, and you brung up them, and I just want to clarify that Norwood's not getting any money. Cincinnati didn't get any money. The developers are getting the money, not Cincinnati, not Norwood. This is developer money. So I want to clarify that in case anyone misunderstood that. That's all I wanted to. I just want to say that. So I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Bowling.
And through the president, just as a counter to that, Mr. Braden, part of what the banks used their funding for was to bring, when the Bengals were in the Super Bowl, which just seems unlikely to happen this year. But it's not impossible yet, so everyone hold out hope. Part of what the banks used that funding for was to lure the NFL to have a playoff game in Cincinnati. And so while, yes, that funding didn't go to the city of Cincinnati, the hotels in downtown, the restaurants in downtown, the retail in downtown all benefited from the playoff game happening in Cincinnati. And without the bank's community authority having the money to pay for the programming that supported that event, which was what lured the NFL to host a game here or in downtown Cincinnati, that would not have happened, and all of those hotels and all of that tourism money would not have come to Cincinnati. So while the money does not directly benefit the city of Cincinnati, they certainly benefit tangentially because of the tourism that it brings to the area. And so while, yes, the city of Norwood, I would not foresee receiving any income because that's not what the community authority establishes, I do think there could be tangential benefits to other businesses in the area, to other hotels in the area. Certainly, benefits in terms of providing free community programming for residents of Norwood. So I think but I absolutely see where you're coming from, that the money benefits the developer ultimately. But I think we have to zoom out a little bit and see how it impacted the area, the region of where that happens. And I don't know whether that would happen here. I can't see the future. I don't even know if this will pass. I don't even know how I'm going to vote on it. But I think it's important to consider kind of the ripple effect that these sort of things can have.
I have a question for Ms. Bowling, please.
Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. So which playoff game are you referencing? Can I ask you that? Which playoff game are you referencing? That they was funded by the bank's money?
The game wasn't funded by the banks, but the bank's community authority was able to, I'm happy to send you the article that I found on
Well, that's fine. The reason why I asked is because I was at the playoff game with Pittsburgh, and I think that was before the banks was even created. So I'm not sure if that is going to impact us having I respect your opinion, and I'm not trying to I think I was at a playoff game before the banks was created. So, I just want to just go ahead and bring that out there, that I don't think because of that, that's going to happen. So I just want to clarify that. But I certainly appreciate the fact that having a pool of money and inserting it into community you know, to actually activate that part of the community. I certainly am fine with that. I just, you know, I just don't want to, I don't want to get confused to think that just because this happened, we didn't have playoff. I don't believe that, that's the case, so.
Sure. What I'll say to
Thank you
that,
for
if I
trying
can,
to, you know,
if I can respond, what I'll say to that is that that's
know.
not my opinion. That's actually just a fact that I found doing
Okay.
research about
All right.
this, that the bank's community authority worked with the NFL in
I
order
appreciate
to
that.
help
Thank you. Thank you,
provide
Ms. Bowles.
programming.
Mrs. Hoover.
I would like
I apologize
clarify.
for interjecting, but I think that what she's meaning is that they would have an event down there and show the game. It wasn't the actual football game.
Of course. I understand what she was trying to.
Okay,
She was trying to teach me. I understand exactly.
My question is it the developer's money or is it the authority's money?
It's the authority's money. And it's made up of a board that's, you know, again, 3 of them are appointed by the developer, 4 of them are appointed by you. And so at the banks, for example, that's not owned by a single developer. Well, they bought, it currently is actually a lot, but it will still exist. If POK decided tomorrow to sell a portion of the property to investor X and a portion of the property to investor Y, or if the developer came in to build a hotel, those entities still have a right collectively to appoint some of those board members, but as time, you know, passes, that entity, which is the NCA, which is operated by this board that runs the district, will you know, last beyond this current quote developer that is, you know, basically petitioning you to form the NCA. So it's a little bit of a different dynamic. If that answers your question.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Ms. Royce?
I wanted to wait until everybody was really tired of it before I shared my opinion. I mean, I just wanted to, I'm repeating what other people have said, but I mean, I came in, I was like, my initial response was no, like, I don't think PLK needs any more money from the community. But upon learning more, I was of the opinion that it would create actually more transparency to have the board, because then we know where PLK is spending some of its profits. And in fact, we would have the majority on the board. The city would have 4 appointments, while PLK has 3, again, repeating what other people have said. But, I mean, I'm not, at the end of the day, I saw a lot of comments on Facebook saying it's corporate greed. It is. It's definitely just taking money and spending it. And at the end of the day, PLK's motives, I'm sure, are profit-driven. So if it's, again, I came in, by the end I was pretty neutral, but if it's this unpopular, I'm leaning no. But I just wanted to make it clear, again, that I think everybody who sits on council takes what everybody says. We listen, we read. I do think Friday to Tuesday is enough time to read the packets. I managed to do it most of the time. We had 800 pages last time, so I will admit I skimmed. I did not read all of the audit. Yeah, so I want to everybody up here works really hard. We all do consider what you have to say. And I'm really proud to work with everybody who's up here. So, and thank you for coming out and speaking. So that's where I'm at.
Thank you. Ms. Bowling?
I'll make this short. I'm sure everybody's tired. Yeah, I just want to second that because this is a public entity, the community authority that exists at the banks, we were able to put in a public records request and receive their statement of receipts, disbursements, and changes in their cash basis. You're okay. If they did not have this community authority and they were just a developer who ran the banks, we would have no right to this information. We could not ask them to show us how they were spending all of their money. We would have no access to this information and they would not be obligated to release this to us. But because they are a public entity, we've talked about transparency a lot, there is a legal obligation for transparency that exists within this community authority. So anyone, whether you are a resident of Norwood or not, I'm not a resident of Cincinnati, but I was able to access this information, could submit a records request to this board should it come to exist, and could receive this information. So you could see exactly where the money was going. You could see exactly how much money they earned, and how they were spending it. And so I think if transparency is the goal, if transparency or a lack thereof is the concern, this is sort of addressing that. This does provide a certain level of transparency that were the developer just to raise their rents in order to help cover the cost of this, they have no reason or obligation to release that information to us. We would have no idea how they were spending that. They could just be pocketing it, that could be going to payroll, and they would not have any obligation to tell us that. So I do think there is a benefit in that way to this being a public entity.
Ms. Royce?
Sorry, and I'm going to piggyback on that. I think that's what Councilwoman Hoover was getting at earlier when she said that PLK can get this money. They can raise anything 2% to get this same money. But if we had the community authority, we would have, again, we would have the transparency, we would have the members on the board. The community would have more of a say in how some of this money is spent. So that was sort of where I was at before a lot of public input. But yeah, it just comes down to how you want them, I guess, to make this money and how you want them to spend it. Either through the 2% on your receipt, or maybe through the rents, maybe through admission fees to other things, who knows? But I think they're going to get the money regardless, in my opinion, because again, at the end of the day, they are a corporation, so.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Motion on the floor by Mrs. Hoover, seconded by Mrs. Bowling, is to have the second reading of the resolution. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
No.
Mr. Braden?
Yes.
By a motion of 5-1, the motion carries. Please have the second reading of the resolution.
A resolution organizing the Factory 52 Community Authority, establishing the boundaries of the authority, appointing members of the Board of Trustees of the authority, establishing the method for selecting the Board of Trustees of the authority, establishing the method for dissolution of the authority, and fixing the surety bond amount for the members of the Board of Trustees.
Thank you. Moving on to the next item. This is an ordinance amending the provisions and fee schedule under Chapter 1305.05 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances and declaring an emergency. Mr. Garten.
I make a motion to have the second reading.
Motion by Mr. Garten to have the second reading. Mrs. Franzen.
I second.
Seconded by Mrs. Franzen. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen.
I just want to double check since I wasn't here 2 weeks ago. This was read then and it's about the building department fees, correct? Thank you. That's what I thought, but with all the PLK stuff, there's a lot in my brain.
Yeah. Mr. Garten.
I just want to send a thank you to Mr. Wolf, the building department manager. He submitted much more, or not much more, but a little more information and background on this. For the sake of, we haven't had a committee of the whole meeting in months, but I do think it's important, as was said earlier, to make sure that we're giving due process. My disappointment with the last one was the urgency to get it through on an emergency basis. I think we spend too much time giving things emergency whenever we should be planning ahead to try to get these things done in a democratic manner. So anyways, if you haven't read, it makes a lot of sense as to why we haven't updated the policy, and then we've updated to try to catch up, but we're still not even caught up yet. Anyways, I'm done.
And I know we do have the letter later on in the agenda from Mr. Wolf. Mr. Wolf, would you like to, he is not here. All right, I was under the impression he would be this evening. All right. We'll move on. Any further discussion? All right, motion on the floor by Mr. Gerton, seconded by Mrs. Franzen, is to have the second reading of the ordinance. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Please have the second reading of the ordinance.
Ordinance approving the final planned development PUD, planned unit development PUD.
Not that one. This was amended.
Ordinance amending the provisions and fee schedules under Chapter 1305.05 of the Norwood Codified Ordinances and declaring an emergency.
Moving on to introductory readings of ordinances and resolutions. The first is an ordinance approving the final planned unit development, PUD plan, for the property known as 1631 Sherman Avenue, Hamilton County, parcel number 651-0049-0073-00, a 108-unit apartment development known as the Sherman Avenue Apartments. Ms. Royce.
I move we have the first reading.
Motion by Ms. Royce to have the first reading. Is there a second? Mr. Garten.
I second the motion.
Seconded by Mr. Garten. Any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Garten?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Please have the first reading of the ordinance. Yes.
Ordinance approving the final planned unit development, PUD plan for the property known as 1631 Sherman Avenue, Hamilton County, parcel number 651-0049-0073-00, a 108-unit apartment development known as the Sherman Avenue Apartments.
Thank you. Next item is a resolution authorizing disposal of personal property and declaring an emergency. Ms. Royce.
I'd move we have the first reading.
Motion by Ms. Royce to have the first reading. Mrs. Hoover.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Ms. Royce.
I did have a question, and I don't know if Mr. Powers is the best person to answer this. I know this is disposing of some firearms. Do we, right? I'm assuming these were guns.
Yeah.
I'm not a gun expert. Yeah. So do we know what company we are using to dispose of the firearms?
I do not.
Just out of curiosity. I know last year I read a couple news articles about how some companies that claim to dispose of firearms, they recycle them, and they actually just they dispose of part of it, but then keep parts and sell them as kits to make new guns. So if we are paying someone to destroy of the guns, I would like to make sure they fully destroy the guns and do not resell kits. If I didn't have time to reach out to Chief Sumner
I can
today.
get that information.
Okay. I just wanted, that's why I asked for one reading, because I would like that information before obviously, at the end of the day, I would like it all destroyed, but just to be sure.
Thank you. Mrs. Hoover.
I also had a question for Mr. Powers. Is this for all of 2024, or is this part of the list?
I don't know that information.
Okay, thank you.
Apologize.
Thank you. Mrs. Franzen.
And for those of you who don't have the full packet or didn't read it, it is guns, some of which were confiscated, some of which were surrendered, and also drugs, all of which were confiscated through criminal proceedings or investigations by the Norwood Police Department.
Thank you. Mrs. Bowling.
I also would love clarity on this line, whereas each item of personal property on Exhibit A and Exhibit B has a current resale value of less than $1,000. How is that determined for controlled substances?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that one.
The line, whereas each item of personal property on Exhibit A and Exhibit B, Exhibit A being firearms and accessory items, and Exhibit B being controlled drugs and related personal property, has a current resale value of less than $1,000. How is that determined on controlled drugs?
They probably are using the street value of those drugs. I did actually receive an answer, so
right.
kudos to Lieutenant Carl Fair.
Wow.
Watching the meeting and sending me a message.
That was so fast.
The guns are shredded and no components are available for reuse.
Amazing. Okay, that's all I was curious about. And then I would guess it's under $1,000 because we technically cannot resell the drugs. Because I do some of
So
this
they
at my other
default
job.
to $0.
I would say the actual value.
Okay.
Because it's resale value. I'm assuming you can't resell
That makes
the
a lot of
drugs.
sense.
Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. So am I the only one who thinks it's ridiculous that we're destroying items of value? Like, we're sitting here in fiscal emergency and the state is overseeing our finances and pieces that are worth $1,000 or less, we're going to destroy. Am I the only one who looks at this and says, why are we destroying this? Why can't we resell these and put them, I was here when we went through this and we wanted to us as an entity wanted to destroy these, and I was opposed to it then, and I just can't understand why we wouldn't resell and gain the value for those. That's all. I'm just, one of those things. I guess I'm the only one, or does anybody else have that thought?
Ms. Royce?
I would say, I understand where you're coming from as far as monetary value, but I would also, I believe the mayor said this when he introduced the ordinance, and I'm in agreement that these were guns that were either surrendered by the individuals or used in a crime. And frankly, as a city council representative, I don't feel like it's very moral or ethical for the city to resell guns that were used in crimes, especially if those guns are used again in another crime or, heaven forbid, hurt someone else intentionally or unintentionally. So that's my opinion.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Mrs. Bowling?
I mean, you don't have to beat me up. If you guys don't agree, you don't agree. You don't have to. Like, it's okay if you want to, but you don't have to. So,
We're good? Any further discussion? Mrs. Suber?
I'm not beating anyone up. I just wanted to share that I had a conversation with the police chief about that. And honestly, I thought he would, not before this, but he was very much believing that this makes their job easier. This makes their job safer because there's so many, 178, I believe, guns that were confiscated. Those are now gone off the streets. So for me, keeping our officers safe is pretty high. I'm sorry, 149. I want to exaggerate. And then just sort of another random question. I have a friend who's a real gun aficionado, like major gun aficionado. And I asked his opinion on it because I don't know. I'm not a gun aficionado. And he said most of these tend to be garbage guns. In that they don't really have, these are not high quality, these are not guns that a collector would necessarily want. And I do believe these are all under $1,000 guns, that the special ones, the really, the heirlooms are not being destroyed. Isn't that correct, Mr. Mayor? If there was a gun that had a specific dollar value or historical significance, that would not be included in this list.
Mayor Schneider?
That's correct. There are antique style guns that are confiscated, that are not damaged, not destroyed. But, as we sit here talking, there's probably another 1,000 handguns that the handgun manufacturers in America have made today. And I just don't think we need to compete with them. That was my whole point with it before. It's like, there's so many guns out there. Why can't the city get rid of 178, take them out of circulation, take them out of there? Because we know the handgun manufacturers are out there stamping them every day. They already made 5 more just while I was talking. And we just do not need them out on the street.
Mrs. Franzen?
5 more.
As a small gun aficionado, looking at that list, it's a lot of crap, a lot of bad handguns, a lot of not great handguns that would not go for high prices. Like some of those brands I had to look up, like they're so bad. Anyway, that's kind of beyond the point. Regardless of whether they're good or not, I'm glad they're getting off the street, and I'm glad that we are not reselling them.
Thank you. Mrs. Boland?
Yeah, I'm not a gun aficionado. I've shot a gun. My mom took me to a gun range on my 21st birthday. She wanted to make sure I was, my mom is a gun person. She wanted to make sure I was comfortable. I was not. But, personal opinions about guns totally aside, if we just take that out of the conversation, I think, most of these guns are probably modified, or at least some of them, they're likely not all safe for use. And I think that as a city, as a legislator, as a government, it is not our job to be circulating firearms to our citizens. No matter how you feel about firearms, I think that's just not our role. That's not what our job is here in the city. And again, I just don't think that these are of quality, that they are probably all safe to use or desirable. And if they are valued at over $1,000, then this would not apply to them.
Mr. Braden?
Thank you, Mr. President. So yeah, just a couple things. I don't want to go on. My choice isn't to battle anybody tonight. I have things in my mind. I want to say them, and I just want to say them out of respect to everyone here. That the only thing I want to take issue with you, with Ms. Hoover, is that you assume that if we do these go to sale, that law-abiding citizens that go to buy these guns, you would assume that they would be back on the streets for other promiscuous involvement. But the other thing that I would say to your point, Ms. Bowling, is that I do know that in the Constitution, it does say that the government should not get involved in my firearms. But you're saying we should get involved and destroy them. So in my opinion, my argument works to where yours, you've got to change the so that's just my opinion, and I respect yours as well.
Thank you.
Mrs. Hoover.
My only comment would be that the guns are ours. They're the city's, and the city is choosing to destroy them. So they're not.
It's out of my control. I've said what I have to say.
Thank you.
Mrs. Bowling.
And just as a response, the statement that I made is not the city should destroy your guns. The statement I made is the city should stay out of gun distribution, which is even more so saying that the government should stay out of you and your gun use. It is not our job to sell guns.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Motion on the floor by Ms. Royce, seconded by Mrs. Hoover, is to have the first reading of the resolution. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Girton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Moving on to the next item, this is an ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2024 and declaring an emergency. Mrs. Franzen.
I move we suspend the rules and have all three readings for this one.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to suspend the rules and have all three readings of the ordinance. Ms. Royce.
I'll second.
Seconded by Ms. Royce. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen.
I know we just had a discussion about trying to do all three readings. For me, at least, this type of thing where it's just moving numbers around that are in pretty small amounts, it's not like we're gaining or losing money, they're just going to different accounts. It's something that needs to be done pretty quickly, and I know that there were some issues with payroll needing to be made, so that's why I feel like it's okay for me to do all three readings tonight for this one.
Thank you. Any further discussion? Mrs. Bowling.
And this is just moving an equal amount of money out of one fund and into 4 separate funds?
Yes.
Great.
Any further discussion? Motion on the floor by Mrs. Franzen, seconded by Ms. Royce, is to suspend the rules and have all three readings of the ordinance. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Girton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Please have all three readings of the ordinance.
Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2024 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2024 and declaring an emergency. Ordinance to change appropriations for the year 2024 and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Mrs. Franzen.
I move we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to pass the ordinance. Mrs. Bowling.
I second.
Seconded by Mrs. Bowling. Any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Girton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. And for the purpose of process and procedure, I will have Ms. Assoff read the resolution regarding the property because I skipped over her actually having the first reading of that resolution.
A resolution authorizing disposal of personal property and declaring an emergency.
Thank you. Moving on to the last item. This is an ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into an agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, for the FY 2025 urban paving project for a portion of US 22 Montgomery Road in the city of Norwood with emergency provision. Mrs. Franzen.
I move we suspend the rules and have all three readings of this one.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to suspend the rules and have all three readings of the ordinance. Mrs. Hoover.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Mrs. Franzen.
I'm really excited for Montgomery Road to be repaved. And I want us to get the money immediately, as soon as we can, tomorrow.
Any further discussion? Motion on the floor by Mrs. Franzen, seconded by Mrs. Hoover, is to suspend the rules and have all three readings of the ordinance. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Girton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Please have all three readings of the ordinance.
Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into an agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, for the fiscal year 2025 urban paving project for a portion of US 22 Montgomery Road in the city of Norwood with emergency provision. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into an agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, for the fiscal year 2025 urban paving project for a portion of US 22 Montgomery Road in the city of Norwood with emergency provision. Ordinance authorizing the Safety Service Director to enter into an agreement with the Ohio Department of Transportation, ODOT, for the fiscal year 2025 urban paving project for a portion of US 22 Montgomery Road in the city of Norwood with emergency provision.
Thank you. Is there a motion to pass the ordinance? Mrs. Franzen.
I move we pass the ordinance.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to pass the ordinance. Mrs. Hoover.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Mrs. Hoover.
I was just wondering if we would be able to have an update on what is the current status of the Montgomery Road plan.
Mr. Powers.
Are you talking about the pedestrian improvement project, or are you talking about the urban paving project?
Well, both.
So this piece of legislation is specific to the urban paving project. So that's just the milling, the repair to the road, the paving from corp line to corp line. So that will be set for later in 2025. Pedestrian improvement project will have a presentation at the next council meeting by JMA to kind of go through that in a little bit more detail. JMA, for those following at home, is the city's engineer. So other than kind of that being where that is, I don't know if you have specific questions that I can.
So things like curb cuts, that would be in the presentation?
Yes.
Okay,
That's correct.
fantastic, thank you.
Well,
Thank you. Any further discussion? Motion on the floor by Mrs. Franzen, seconded by Mrs. Hoover, is to pass the ordinance. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Girton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Moving on to the next item on the agenda, we have administration reports. Mayor Schneider?
I'll make mine brief,
Mike.
because we are going a little bit longer. I don't know why he always calls me Mike, but just a couple of quick things. One is, it's interesting, this council, after hearing people speak, it's funny because this council has spent a lot of time and effort and actually does its homework more than any other council even the councils that I was on years ago. This council has a lot of discussion and really goes through the steps for these. And I commend these council members on the investigation, on listening to people, on really reaching out to people and people reaching out to them. And that's what it comes down to. But it's interesting to listen to certain statements being made and you would think, oh, there's something wrong. There's nothing wrong. You are very much doing your job right, the way it should be done. And I appreciate that as the mayor and a person who's been involved in this for a long time. On the community authority, I definitely, for myself with Factory 52, I endorse it 100%. And I do that as a citizen of the city of Norwood, as a resident who walks over there, as a resident that's walked over there with my wife in an evening and sat down and listened to a band play and watched kids frolicking on the lawn and all the fun that it brings to it. And I think we lose sight of the fact that those things aren't a given. I mean, up to this point, the developer has been trying to build momentum and get people there, yes, and they're spending their money on it. But putting together the community authority and taking a pocket of that money and putting it in a separate bank account that's there well after PLK is gone. It was sort of implied that it's going into PLK's bank account. That money's not going into PLK's bank account. That's going into the community authority fund. And that'll be here 20 years from now. And hopefully 20 years from now, that band stage will still be used. And there will still be events where they put a big screen up there and they say, come on over and watch the football game. Watch an Ohio State football game. Watch the UC game right here. And you can go there and sit and do it for nothing. You don't have to spend a dime. But if you do go over and buy a beer, 5 cents of that beer money is going to go towards a community authority thing. So I 100% endorse that. Not because it's PLK. I endorse it because it brings something to the city of Norwood that we don't have. And you can say, well, there's organizations, and there are organizations, and they do a lot of good. Just ran in the 5K. Okay, I walked in the 5K. Ran in the 5K, right? I like to say that. But that 5K, the funds from that, they've done a great job building momentum, and they've got funds, and they put it into our parks. All those are great things. This is just another great thing for the city of Norwood. So that's one of the reasons why I endorse it, and why I hope that council members will really look at it closely and say, what does it bring to our community? You know, and that's an important part. And then, you know, the other part is this development that's going on Sherman. That's going to be the final planned unit development that we're trying to get passed right now for 1631 Sherman. Those plans, they've came back, they've talked, you know, people have to realize they're going in front of the planning commission. The planning commission's giving them the once over and saying, bring stuff back to us. Here's your preliminary, here's your final. It's got to go from there, from the planning commission to city council. You got public hearings, there is so much going on that people don't see at times, and they sit at home and somebody, I guess, posts on Facebook, you know, this is what's going on, and they jump right on that train. Instead of thinking negatively about what the city is doing, try to think positively about what the city is doing, because this community has gotten nothing but better. The amenities, the things that our children and our children's children can enjoy now in the city of Norwood are better than they were 5 years ago. Better than they were 10 years, better than when I grew up. That swim pool looks much nicer. We never had a recreation center like that. We never had a senior center that looks like good. So I think everybody needs to try to keep thinking positively about the improvements that are being made and what it brings to us and what it brings to our families. So those are important parts. There was one other. I do want to talk. Eric Thompson sat on this council with a lot of you, and Eric had came to me when it was freezing cold out, and he said, Victor, we need a way to help people. We need to do these warming centers. And Susan, I know you've talked to me about the cooling centers and stuff. The city doesn't have the wherewithal to do that. We don't have staff sitting around. We don't really have the ability to do that. This is great. When you talk about somebody like Carolyn Myers, working with, you know, Pastor or Bishop James and working with Pastor Mingo, I mean, that's exactly what should be happening in our community. That's nothing but good for all of us. So those are the three things. I hope that at the next council meeting that you will have the 4 names of the people. Mr. Braden, you talked about knowing a couple of people that want to be on it. I'm sure there are other people that are interested. I'm hoping that you have those 4 names and that it gets passed at the next council meeting, because it is absolutely a positive for the city of Norwood. Are there challenges with that new development? Yes. There are challenges. We know bringing this many people, you talked about a number of people coming in from outside, a large number. I mean, I didn't realize that number was so big. There are challenges. We are working with them. We've got a good safety service director that's working with them. We've got good legal representation when it comes to the different funding tools that are out there. Mike Skelly with our community development group. These are people that are all working. Every day they're working and looking at those things, and they're listening to people and trying to make positive improvements. So, you know, I once again, I feel like I'm up here sort of on a soapbox, and I apologize if it sounds like I'm a preacher, because I don't mean to be that way, but I think, please, keep a positive outlook on this. Don't go negative and then try to dig yourself out of that negative area, think positively about it. Think up here. And then if you need to take it down a little bit, and you guys you've reconsidered things many, many times and made the right decisions. And I really do appreciate all that this city council does to move the city forward and to really look at all the perspectives and listen to people, because you guys are stellar, in my opinion, when it comes to that type of stuff. So I think that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any questions for Mayor Snyder? All right, Mr. Bonzo.
Thank you, Mr. President. I actually don't have a report necessarily about the Treasurer's Office, but I do have a couple of comments I did want to make. I just want to say that I do highly recommend that you all look into finding ways to speed up this PUD process. So specifically with the Sherman Apartments. So they came, and submitted their original plans, I think in like May, to the Planning Commission, and got their preliminary PUD approved, I think at the end of August by this council. And then once they had that preliminary, they submitted their final PUD plan to Planning Commission in probably September, and the Planning Commission approved it October 2nd. And as the gentleman that was here said, I haven't heard any negative comments about the Sherman apartment project. So on October 2nd, the final PUD was approved. A letter was sent to council that was read at that first council meeting in October. And there has to be 30 days for a public hearing to be scheduled. So that put it out to the last meeting in November. So that was close to 40 days, I think, from when you all originally got that letter. If you just do one reading at a time, it's not going to be approved until the December 23rd meeting. And there's no emergency clause on this ordinance, so they can't actually get their permit until 30 days after you all even approve it. So the time from when you all first got that letter to when they're going to be able to get their building permits, it's 113 days. And to me, there's ways, we talk about ways that we are wanting to be business friendly, and we want the city to work well with people, and then and the developer today asked for 3 readings, and there was nothing kind of against it. There was really no great reason not to do the 3 readings, because they've come and done, they've done the preliminary in the past, they did the final this time. I mean, it'll be almost 9 months from when they first start the process to when they actually get the ability to do their building. And if there wasn't a PUD on the property, if they just developed it outright, it would be much, much quicker, because they wouldn't have to go before Planning Commission. They would just have to go before BZA if there were variances. So I don't know exactly what the solution is. I know that some cities, they start doing their readings, the 2 meetings before the actual public hearing, so that the public hearing coincides with the 3rd reading. So that way, you can kind of cut down that. There's probably other things that can be done too, but just wanted you all to hopefully look at it. It's not something that I necessarily saw when I was on council. So again, I'm not judging you all, but I just think it's something that I think we can do better, at least for some of these projects like the Sherman apartment building. That seems like a really good positive for the city. And with that, that's all I have.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Bonzo? All right. Mr. Miracle.
Thank you, Mr. President. Nothing to share this evening.
All right. Mr. Moore.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do have a few things to share. I do want to echo what the mayor said about this council in particular. I've worked with a lot of councils, been on a lot of councils, and this is about the best prepared and most curious that I have seen. And I mean, and serious, with good ideas. I'm curious, what does this mean? What does this do? And I get a lot of phone calls from my role as law director. A lot of times that makes my job harder. But this is not and I've stopped predicting for people, because I have been on council with people, I've been in councils where if it came to council, 95% chance 3 readings passed that night. And it was very little thought, very little discussion about a lot of things. I don't predict this council because I never know, because it's all very different, but you do take your job seriously. And so I just want to echo what the mayor said about the job you do. I wanted to mention tonight we had a hearing on phase 2. Final PUD plans for PLK. We did not have an ordinance on that. PLK wants to do all of it together at the December meeting with the hearings on all the other aspects of their PUD plans, including the 2 overlays and a bunch of other things. Exactly how that's going to work on an ordinance basis, I'm not quite sure yet. But that's why there was not an ordinance on that. And I also wanted to follow up on what Mr. Bonzel said, and what I have recommended to developers. And I'm going to repeat it again we have members we have the planning director here, and we got the administrator, we got the president of council, is that when council gets a letter from, and I've always recommended this, council, when the planning commission is done looking at something, and they've approved a plan for something, and it's coming to council, then come to council before the public hearing. Come to the meeting and to meet one of the two meetings in between and give an explanation of what the project is. And this, the Sherman Avenue is not a tough one. PLK is a complicated project, and there are other ones that have been very complicated. And you may walk in and say, well, I don't know, because I have a question about this thing and that thing, and there's dialogue that may need to happen, and either with the economic or the community, economic development, whatever it's called this term, committee, or with council as a whole, is that that's something to pass on to the developers. It's like, okay, planning commission's approved it, the letter's going to go. You might want to go to that meeting or the meeting after that and give a presentation on what your project is. And that gives everybody a time to think about it and see what it is and wonder, oh, I don't know if that's the best idea, or I'm going to try to wrap my head around this. And I've always recommended that to the developers when I have a chance. And that's just something I would point to in the future for anything else that comes from planning commission comes to council for a public hearing. So, and unless there's any questions, that's all I got.
Thank you. Questions for Mr. Moore? All right. Moving on to unfinished business. Mrs. Bowling.
I'm gonna go first because I know my list is shorter. It was exactly one thing. I mentioned at the last council meeting that I was hosting an event called Legally Wed at the main library downtown in Cincinnati. That event happened this past Sunday. I am thrilled to report that we had a phenomenal team of volunteers, including quite a great showing of Norwood residents. I had lawyers and notaries and officiants from Norwood who volunteered their time and energy and expertise. We had over 20 volunteers. We had more than 500 people show up to establish legal protections for their families for free. We had 11 couples get married. We had a baker who donated wedding cakes for them. We had a photographer there who took formal photos for them. It was a really lovely community event, and I am very grateful for everyone who showed up and volunteered. I cried twice, so I had to stop witnessing weddings because it was too much. But it was a really beautiful event and a really great show of community and people willing to give of themselves and their knowledge and their expertise. And I am eternally grateful to everybody who showed up, and I am so proud of the folks from Norwood who turned out. It was great.
Thank you. Mrs. Hoover.
I need to just say, I was not there. It was an amazing event. It's all over social media. The news was there. I heard from people who attended. It was a phenomenal event. And I am so proud to see that the work that you've done, you did that. And it was such a big, beautiful thing. And you impacted so many people and so many families. And I am just in awe of you. I mean, really, you are so underplaying this, I can't even. This was a huge, over 500 people. This was a huge, huge event. And I just want to thank you for seeing a need and meeting it and exceeding in such a beautiful way. And I'm just thankful for you being part of our community.
Please don't make me cry again. We're doing it again in January if anyone missed this one.
Any other? Mrs. Hoover.
I got a quick one. Leaves picked up typically the day after trash day, and if it's missed, put it on See Click Fix. Try to put it 3 feet from cars. My husband made the mistake of having it all lined up, and then someone parked right in front of it, and then he was mad. That was his fault. Get it all in one nice little pile. They come back with their big suck thing, and it's phenomenal. If you're not leaving your leaves on the ground for pollinators, which I'm also doing, we're just taking the ones off of the sidewalk.
Mrs. Bowling.
That reminded me of another one. I apologize. If you live on a notoriously narrow street, as I do, there is a very good chance that the leaf vehicle machine cannot come down your street. It does not fit down my street unless there is perfect parking conditions. But what I will say about that, the hack that we found out this year, instead of putting my leaves at the curb for the machine, which may or may not ever be able to make it down my street, we went to the Board of Health and got our free leaf bags and took those to the curb. And it cost us $0 thanks to all of our recycling. And they were picked up that week. So instead of being a rude neighbor who took up a parking spot with leaves for 2 months, like we accidentally did last year, the leaves are all gone. So if you are worried about your street with being leaf machine friendly, you might consider grabbing some free leaf bags.
Thank you. Any other unfinished business? Moving on to new business. Any new business? Mrs. Bowling.
Mine's also shorter. We have, I have been working with our lovely law director to come up with some edits to our proposed food truck ordinance, and we have a lovely tangible document to review now, so I would like to schedule a small business and economic development. It's the Small Business and Economic Development Committee meeting. Thoughts on that?
Oh,
What are you thinking?
I'm thinking, I'm always thinking a Monday or a Tuesday evening where we don't have counselors.
the next 3 Mondays are all okay for me.
I'd like to give a little notice so food truck owners can attend. Mondays are usually best for them as well. What do we think about the 16th of December?
That works for me.
It's good.
Mr. Gerton? 16th is good. Do we want to say 6:30 in council chambers? I will send an email.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
Any other? Mrs. Hoover.
I'm gonna be so super fast. One of these, I believe should be, it's Franzen sharing, that she planted some trees, like a little tree ninja. We also had a really lovely tree planting at Victory Park for Veterans Day. The mayor was there, Candace and I, and Ricky Paul got the tree in the ground. It is a red oak, which will be here for generations. So that's really exciting, and I want people to know that was happening. Norwood celebrates MLK with services happening again this year. We've got the blood drive on Saturday, January the 11th. Just sort of start knowing that I'm going to come after you for that. And Emily's Garden, the beautiful community garden that we have at Hunter Park. They're currently harvesting garlic there, and they just planted over 100 tulip bulbs, and you can meander by and get fresh herbs for Thanksgiving. It's a truly beautiful, magical place, and I encourage folks to check it out. Then my last item is not mine. This is the Norwood Historical Society is having a prohibition event at Northwood Cidery next Thursday at 6:30. The event link is on the Historical Society's Facebook page. Tickets are $22, which includes a prohibition cocktail, food, cherry tastings, historical presentation, a cidery tour, and fun interactive games. Susan Daniels with the Historical Society is also making headbands for the ladies to wear that they can keep. So more fun community stuff happening. I want to check that out. And that is all I have. Thank you.
Mrs. Franzen.
Yep. The one thing I have is, yes, I confess, I did plant some trees. It was me and Candace. We went up to Lindner Park and we planted 6 oaks and 2 hazelnuts. I fenced them and I sprayed them down with a deer fence, so hopefully they will survive the winter without getting eaten by the deer that are there. Literally one approached while I was planting it and I yelled at it. It went away. So if you see them there, they are fenced. I think I need to secure the fences a little better, but hopefully they will survive and help replace some of the large oaks that have unfortunately died up in Lindner Park in the past couple of years.
Thank you. Just one reminder again that the second meeting in December, the city council meeting, will be on Monday, December the 23rd. So we are not meeting on Christmas Eve. We are moving that meeting up one day. And we do currently have 5 public hearings scheduled for that meeting. Just as a reminder, And then also next Tuesday is a committee of the whole meeting.
It's December.
All right. Mr. Braden.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just have a comment. As far as, you just mentioned our 5 public meetings on December 23rd.
Public hearings, yes.
Public hearing, I'm sorry, excuse me. I'm just concerned about it being on the 23rd of December, and us having public meetings and asking our residents to come out on the day before Christmas Eve. And that's just something that comes to mind, and whether we can deal with it or whether we can't deal with it, whether we have to do it, that's okay. A concern is that our residents are busy that time of year, and on December 23rd, trying to come out for 5 public hearings, we might not get a adequate response that we would need. So that's just the comment that I wanted to make, and I appreciate everybody's listening.
Understand, just for clarity purposes, due to legal timing, that was what worked to meet those requirements for the public hearings, which was better than having it on our regularly scheduled meeting night, which would have been Christmas Eve.
Well, Mr. President, I appreciate that. I appreciate that response. I don't know if it is comforting to the residents that will not be able to make it on the 23rd, but I do appreciate that. Thank you.
Mrs. Bowling.
I absolutely share those concerns. I know many people are out of town. Folks can send any statements for the public hearings in advance. Mr. President, can you advise how they should do that?
They can send that to council@norwoodohio.gov. And from there, that goes to the clerk of council's office, and those can be shared with all members of council as they are received. Any further new business? All right, moving on to communications. The first is a letter from Ralph Wolf, Chief Building Official, regarding building department fees. Mr. Garten.
I make a motion that we accept and file the letter as if read.
Motion by Mr. Garten to receive and file the letter as if read. Is there a second? Ms. Royce.
I say. Sorry, very tough.
Wait until I say the name.
I'm sorry. I'm so tired.
Seconded by Ms. Royce. Any discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Next item is a letter from the Norwood Tree Board regarding landscaping plans for Factory 52 Phase 2. Mrs. Franzen.
I'll make a motion that we accept and file the letter as if read.
Motion by Mrs. Franzen to receive and file the letter as if read. Mrs. Hoover.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Hoover. Any discussion? Mrs. Bowling.
I was very excited to receive this letter, and I will be pulling some ideas for plants for my own yard out of this. I think one of the reasons for accepting and filing is read, it's a very long list of words that are complicated to pronounce. And I don't know. If anyone would like this list, I am happy to send it to you. It is a great resource for what plants are native and beneficial to your yard, but maybe not that fun to have to read out loud or listen to at home.
No bitterness here, but I will note that there were no issues with that when I was serving as clerk. In its entirety. The motion on the floor by Mrs. Franzen, seconded by Mrs. Hoover, is to receive and file the letter as if read. Any further discussion? Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. We do have one absent member. Mrs. Bowling.
I move that we excuse Mrs. Winterbauer. She is visiting family for the holidays in St. Louis.
Motion by Mrs. Bowling to excuse Mrs. Winterbauer. Mr. Braden.
I second that.
Seconded by Mr. Braden. Any discussion?
She didn't tell us ahead of time.
Yes. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Gerton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. Is there a motion to adjourn? Mrs. Franzen.
I make a motion to adjourn.
Mrs. Bowling.
I'll second.
Seconded by Mrs. Bowling. Call the roll, please.
Mrs. Franzen?
Yes.
Mrs. Hoover?
Yes.
Ms. Royce?
Yes.
Mrs. Bowling?
Yes.
Mr. Girton?
Yes.
Mr. Braden?
Yes, ma'am.
All members present voting yes, the motion carries. This meeting is hereby adjourned.